January 28, 1944. 30,000 feet above Germany, the air was thin, brittle, and deadly. The contrails of hundreds of bombers stretched across the pale winter sky like scars. Below them lay Berlin, the heart of the Reich, still shrouded in cloud and smoke. Inside one of those aircraft, a B-17 Flying Fortress named Lucky Lady, 10 men sat in silence, each bound by a shared understanding that few on Earth could imagine. The engines roared with the deep, relentless rhythm of power and fear. Frost clung to the glass of the nose turret. Oxygen masks hissed with every breath. Outside, the temperature was 50 degrees below zero. Inside, it was colder still, in the space between courage and dread. The formation stretched for miles. Hundreds of bombers in perfect alignment, their silver bodies glinting against the weak sunlight. The men inside them were young, most barely 20, and yet they carried the weight of an entire nation on their shoulders. Below, Germany burned. The air smelled faintly of oil, metal, and something that could not be named. The scent of history being rewritten one bomb at a time. The target that day was the heart of Berlin. It was not the first raid, nor would it be the last, but it would become one of the most unforgettable. It was a mission that began like so many others: briefings, maps, coordinates, but it would end with a vision that no man aboard would ever forget. For the first time, American pilots would see the capital of the Third Reich consumed in a single, fiery night. They would witness what industrial war truly meant when it reached its zenith. As the bombers approached their initial point, flak began to bloom around them. It came in black, shattering bursts, each explosion forming a sphere of smoke that lingered in the air. The gunners called it flak blossoms. The sound was like gravel thrown against steel, like hail on glass. Every detonation sent vibrations through the fuselage, rattling bolts, shaking nerves. The German anti-aircraft batteries were awake, their timing precise, their range deadly. The sky was filled with explosions that looked almost beautiful in their precision until one hit close enough to tear through metal. One shell burst near Lucky Lady's left wing. Fragments tore through the outer skin, punching holes the size of fists. The aircraft lurched, and for a moment it felt as though gravity itself had vanished. But the crew held their positions. Training overrode fear. The navigator checked his charts. The bombardier adjusted his sight. They were closing in on Berlin, and no one turned back. From 30,000 feet, the city below appeared distant and unreal, a gray expanse bisected by the winding Spree River, its streets faintly illuminated by the last light of dusk. But through the gaps in the clouds, the pilots could see the faint glow of flames. The Royal Air Force had already struck the night before. Smoke rose in columns that twisted into the wind. The Americans were here to finish what the British had begun. Their orders were simple: destroy the rail yards, the industrial districts, and the administrative centers that kept the Nazi machine alive. As the lead formation reached the bomb run, the bombardiers took control. The pilots steadied their hands. In the nose compartment, the Norden bomb sight glowed faintly, a perfect crosshair aimed at the heart of the enemy capital. The voice over the intercom was steady, emotionless. Bombs away. The first bombs fell through the cold air, spinning lazily, disappearing into the clouds below. Then hundreds followed. The bomb bay doors opened across the entire formation, releasing tons of high explosives and incendiaries. The sky filled with dark shapes that tumbled toward the earth like a rain of iron. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then the world below erupted. From the cockpit, the pilots could see flashes bursting through the clouds. The glow spread rapidly, turning the gray beneath them into an inferno of red and orange. Flames leapt through the smoke, flickering like torches on the surface of the earth. The cloud layer reflected the firelight upward, painting the underside of the bombers in a dim, shifting glow. It looked like the world was on fire. For the men in the air, it was both mesmerizing and horrifying. Berlin was burning, and they were the cause. They could see buildings collapsing through the haze, roads vanishing beneath waves of smoke. They could feel the heat even at altitude, carried upward by the rising air. The bombardier watched through his sight as the target disappeared beneath the spreading flames. He whispered a word no one heard because words had no meaning at 30,000 feet, when the earth itself seemed to ignite. The German defenders fought back with everything they had. Searchlights swept across the sky, their beams crossing in brilliant white cones, locking onto the bombers. The moment a plane was caught, flak zeroed in. Tracers rose from the ground like streams of molten light. The gunners aboard the American planes returned fire blindly, their .50 caliber guns rattling against the wind. The formation began to scatter. Aircraft fell from the sky in trails of smoke, their wings sheared off, their engines aflame. Parachutes blossomed briefly, then vanished into the darkness. Inside Lucky Lady, the intercom crackled with short, clipped voices. A gunner reported damage to the tail. Another shouted about losing pressure in the left engine. But the pilot kept the formation. They had a job to finish. The smell of burning hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit. Oxygen masks hid the pale faces of men who had long stopped believing they were mortal. Every mile forward was a test of endurance, every second an act of faith. Then came the moment no one expected. Through the clouds, the bombers broke into clear air. What they saw below would burn itself into memory. Berlin was no longer a city. It was a living sea of fire. Entire districts glowed with white heat. Rivers of flame ran along the streets. The smoke formed a vast column rising miles into the air, feeding itself with oxygen drawn from the burning ground. The city's center was a storm of destruction so vast that it seemed to breathe, inhaling and exhaling in waves of red light. Even from their altitude, the pilots could see the flickering outlines of buildings melting, the reflections of burning railcars, the chaos of explosions merging into one continuous roar. They had seen bombings before, Hamburg, Bremen, Kassel, but never anything like this. This was not destruction. It was transformation. It was as though the heart of a nation had been set alight, and the night itself was collapsing into flame. Some of the younger airmen stared in silence, unable to look away. Others turned their eyes forward, refusing to see what lay behind them. There was no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only awe. Only the cold realization that mankind had found a way to turn the air itself into a weapon. The lead bomber turned west. The rest followed. The formation thinned as damaged planes lagged behind, their engines struggling, their wings trembling from shrapnel hits. The returning journey was silent except for the rhythmic thump of engines and the occasional cry over the radio, a mechanical voice reporting losses, casualties, or coordinates for rescue. The men aboard knew that some of those voices would not be heard again. As the bombers crossed the Rhine, dawn began to break. The light spread across the horizon, pale and lifeless, touching the frost on the cockpit windows. The pilots turned their heads once more toward the east. Even from hundreds of miles away, they could still see the faint orange glow rising behind them. The sky over Berlin was still burning. For the Americans, it was a moment of both triumph and horror. They had struck the center of enemy power, but what they had seen was beyond the language of war. The sky had turned to fire, and the fire had consumed more than buildings. It had consumed belief, innocence, and the illusion that war could be anything other than destruction without end. They returned to their bases in England exhausted, their uniforms stiff with sweat and frost. Mechanics waited on the runways, counting the returning aircraft. Many did not come back. The empty spaces on the tarmac told their own story. Yet no one spoke much that morning. There were no cheers, no songs, only the sound of engines cooling in the cold air and the slow, heavy footsteps of men who had seen too much. The briefing officers recorded the mission as a success. The targets were hit. The losses were acceptable. The data was complete, but the men knew that the numbers meant nothing. They had witnessed something that statistics could not contain. The night over Berlin had shown them the future in which entire cities could be erased from existence, not by armies on the ground, but by fleets in the sky. And as they sat in silence, waiting for the next mission, some wondered if they had seen the end of one world and the beginning of another. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had become the most intense and costly campaign of the Second World War. The Allies had reached a crossroads between victory and exhaustion. Britain had survived the Blitz and retaliated with night raids against German cities, while the United States Army Air Forces had arrived on European soil determined to fight by day, to strike the enemy's heart in broad daylight, and prove that precision bombing could cripple an empire. It was a doctrine of courage and mathematics, of navigation and endurance. Yet for those who flew it, the theory dissolved in the flames of reality. Berlin was more than a target, it was a symbol. The capital of Hitler's Reich represented the psychological center of Nazi power. the core from which every command of conquest had radiated since 1939. To strike it from the sky was not merely an act of destruction, but a declaration that the walls of the Third Reich were no longer impenetrable. For 2 years, Berlin had watched the war from a distance, while British bombers ravaged Hamburg, Cologne, and the Ruhr. But by early 1944, that distance had vanished. The Americans were coming in daylight, and the British by night. The combined air offensive was designed to break not only the factories that built the weapons, but the will of a nation that believed itself invincible. At the center of that campaign stood the 8th Air Force, the largest concentration of aerial power ever assembled. From bases across England, Basingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, Ridgewell, to Bolton, thousands of bombers rose into the sky each morning, climbing in slow, spiraling patterns to form massive formations that stretched across the horizon. Their destinations read like a list of industrial anatomy: ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, chemical works, and oil refineries. Each mission was measured in fuel, tonnage, and lives. The crews called them milk runs when they were easy and maximum efforts when they were not. Berlin was never a milk run. The airmen who flew those missions were young, far younger than the weight of their task suggested. The average age of a bomber pilot was 22, of a tail gunner, barely 19. They came from farms, factories, and colleges across America, drawn into the war by duty and necessity. They lived in cold wooden barracks, surrounded by mud and the constant drone of engines. Their world was a cycle of briefings, missions, and funerals. Each morning began with the same question whispered in mess halls and sleeping quarters: where are we going today? When the red string on the map pointed east, toward Berlin, silence followed. To reach Berlin meant flying nearly 1,000 miles round trip through some of the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. The German flak belts around the capital were dense and disciplined. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns ringed the city, firing in synchronized waves that filled the sky with shrapnel. Above them, the Luftwaffe's remaining fighter wings, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, waited to tear apart the formations. For the Americans, survival depended on precision, formation, and faith in the fortress they flew. The Boeing B-17 was more than a machine. It was a statement of engineering philosophy. Designed to absorb damage and return home, it became a symbol of resilience. Its 4 engines, each a Wright's clone radio, could carry it through storms of flak and still limp back across the channel on one propeller. The crews trusted the fortress more than they trusted fate. They gave their planes names like Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, 909, and Lucky Lady. They painted pin-up art and homebound prayers on their noses. Each aircraft was both weapon and shelter, carrying within it the fragile lives of 10 men bound together by routine and terror. By late 1943, the strategic logic of the air campaign had shifted. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Western Europe, and to succeed, they needed to cripple Germany's capacity to resist. That meant destroying its rail systems, oil production, and aircraft industry. Berlin, as the hub of communication and administration, became the ultimate objective. To bomb Berlin was to challenge the myth of German invulnerability, but it was also to invite annihilation. The first American raid on Berlin took place in daylight in November 1943. It ended in disaster. Clouds obscured the targets, and German fighters tore into the formations. 60 aircraft were lost in a single day. The mission was suspended for months, but by January 1944, the Americans had learned, adapted, and returned stronger. They had new escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the long-range P-51 Mustang that could finally follow the bombers all the way to the capital and back. The air war was entering its decisive phase. In those days, weather was the greatest ally and enemy alike. Missions depended on forecasts drawn from fragments of data, barometric pressure, wind currents, and reports from coastal stations. A layer of clouds could mean salvation or doom. On the morning of January 28, 1944, the weather was clear enough to tempt the planners at High Wycombe. They ordered a massive strike, nearly 700 bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, to attack Berlin and its surrounding industrial zones. The crews were briefed before dawn. The target maps were unrolled across long tables under fluorescent lights. Cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air as intelligence officers described the flak belts, the fighter intercept points, and the expected losses. The men listened in silence, knowing that statistics meant little when the sky itself turned hostile. As the sun rose over East Anglia, the bombers began to take off, one after another, from the frosted runways. The roar of engines shook the countryside. Farmers paused in their fields to watch the silver lines ascend into the cold morning air. To them, it looked like a mechanical migration, a river of wings flowing eastward. Within an hour, the sky over England was filled with contrails. From the ground, they looked beautiful. From the air, they meant death. The German radar stations along the coast picked up the formations almost immediately. Alarms rang through Luftwaffe command centers. The defenders scrambled. Squadrons of fighters took off from bases near Hanover, Magdeburg, and Jüterbog. The flak batteries were manned, their barrels lifted toward the horizon. The men below had seen the pattern before and knew what it meant. Berlin was the target. The capital would burn again. The irony of the Allied strategy was that it relied on visibility. The very clarity that made precision bombing possible also made the bombers vulnerable. The daylight raids were a double-edged blade. In theory, the Norden bomb site could drop ordnance within 100 feet of a target from 6 miles up. In practice, wind, smoke, and nerves turned precision into approximation. Yet the Americans persisted. They believed that by day, they could strike the enemy's infrastructure without targeting civilians. It was a belief born of optimism and sustained by necessity. War, however, cared little for belief. For Berliners, the raids had become a grim rhythm of existence. Each day brought the wail of sirens, the rush to shelters, the trembling of walls as the ground shook. The fire brigades worked endlessly, their water reserves running dry, their hoses frozen in winter air. The once grand avenues of the city were lined with ruins and ash. Yet even as the bombs fell, life continued. Trains ran, factories produced, soldiers marched. The propaganda ministries broadcast speeches assuring the people that victory was near, that the enemy's bombs were proof of fear, not strength. But as each raid grew heavier, as each night glowed with the light of burning districts, that illusion began to fade. The Allied commanders understood that the campaign was a test of endurance. The goal was not to destroy Berlin in a single blow, but to break its ability to recover. Each mission, each bomb, each ton of fire was a step toward that end. The losses were expected. The courage required was assumed. Every man who flew to Berlin knew that the odds were against him. But still he went, not out of hatred or heroism, but because the machine of war demanded it. The bombers crossed the North Sea and entered occupied Europe. Below them lay the frozen fields of Holland and the canals of the Zuiderzee. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the contrails that stretched for miles behind them. Each white line marked a crew of 10 men heading toward the same fate. Inside the aircraft, the crews settled into the mechanical rhythm of the mission. Navigation checks, oxygen adjustments, gun positions. The intercom buzzed with brief phrases, professional and calm. Fear was acknowledged only in silence. Ahead lay the flak belts of northern Germany, then the capital itself. The men knew that once they crossed that line, turning back was no longer an option. The formation had to stay tight, the discipline absolute. A single plane out of position could doom dozens. The Germans had learned to exploit any weakness. The air war had become a contest of geometry and timing, a deadly ballet of altitude and speed. On the ground in Berlin, civilians looked up. As the sirens began again, some were too exhausted to move. They had seen the firestorms of Hamburg the previous summer, when Allied incendiaries created winds so strong they ripped people from the streets. They prayed it would not happen here, though many already knew it would. Mothers gathered children, soldiers manned the flak towers, priests opened the doors of half-destroyed churches. In the distance, the low drone of engines grew louder until it filled the air like thunder. In the command bunkers beneath the Reich Chancellery, officers traced the paths of the incoming formations on wall maps. The red markers multiplied. The defenses were ready, but the sheer scale of the attack was overwhelming. It was no longer a battle. It was an oncoming storm. The city that had once orchestrated war across a continent now braced to receive it. As the bombers crossed into German airspace, the first waves of fighters struck. The sky erupted with movement. Silver bombers and dark interceptors clashed amid clouds of flak smoke. The gunners fired until their barrels glowed. The engines roared in agony. Some planes went down immediately, their wings sheared apart by cannon fire. Others burned silently as they fell through the layers of cloud. The survivors pressed on, tightening formation, closing ranks against the stone. They were heading toward the same destination, bound by the same command. Berlin awaited below, a city that still believed itself eternal. But as the bombers approached, the truth became clear: eternity burns too. By the time the bombers reached the outskirts of Berlin, the sky had turned into a living battlefield. The blue horizon was shredded by contrails and smoke, and the sound of engines filled every inch of the air. There was no silence anymore, only vibration. The Luftwaffe had risen in force. Dozens of German fighters broke through the outer escort line, diving headlong into the bomber formations. They attacked from above and below, slicing through the air at nearly 500 miles per hour. From the cockpit of a B-17, they appeared suddenly, small black shapes that swelled into the faces of death before vanishing in bursts of tracers. The airmen had seconds to react. The gunners of the formation fired their .50 caliber Brownings until the barrels smoked. Shell casings rattled across the floor, bouncing against oxygen bottles and ammunition belts. In the waist section of each bomber, the smell of credite mixed with the metallic tang of blood and oil. A gunner shouted something that was lost in the roar. The vibrations from the engines became indistinguishable from the thunder of flak exploding around them. For the pilots, it was like flying through a storm of iron. The instruments trembled. Every few seconds a shockwave hit the fuselage, and the entire plane jumped. The flak bursts were timed to altitude, detonating in tight patterns meant to tear the formation apart. Black smoke sears blossomed across the sky, each one filled with shards of steel. Some of those fragments passed clean through aluminum skin and flesh alike. The bombers that were hit did not always explode. Some simply drifted out of formation, engines sputtering, wings riddled with holes. A few caught fire and spun slowly, silently downward, the crew trapped inside as the horizon turned around them. From above, it looked like chaos. But within the chaos was rhythm. Every move, every counter, every maneuver had been practiced, refined, repeated, until instinct replaced thought. The bombers did not scatter. They held together. The pilots aligned their wings within inches of one another, trusting that discipline would save them where armor could not. Each aircraft was a link in a fragile chain stretching from England to the heart of the Reich. If one broke, others might follow. So they flew on, straight and level, through the worst of it. For the Germans, this was desperation disguised as valor. The Luftwaffe pilots who intercepted the bombers in early 1944 were no longer the veterans of 1940. Many were young, barely trained, pulled from flight schools that had shortened their courses as fuel and time ran out. They faced overwhelming odds. The P-51 Mustangs now escorted the bombers all the way to the target, and their long-range superiority had changed the balance of the sky. Yet the Germans came anyway. They came in waves of courage and futility, diving into the formation until their ammunition was gone or their aircraft destroyed. Each pass cost them another life, another name erased from the rosters of squadrons that were dying faster than they could be replaced. Below, Berlin waited. The city had been attacked many times before, but never like this. The Royal Air Force had struck by night, their bombers spreading incendiaries that created vast firestorms. But the Americans came by day, methodical, relentless. The civilians could see them clearly now, hundreds of bombers in perfect lines, the sunlight glinting off their wings. The sight inspired awe and terror in equal measure. Children watched from shattered courtyards as the formations passed overhead. Air raid sirens wailed again, echoing through the ruins. People ran for cellars, tunnels, and the underground stations that served as shelters. Some carried buckets of water, some carried nothing but photographs in the flak towers. The great concrete fortresses that guarded the city. Gun crews loaded shells into the massive barrels of 128mm guns. Each tower had its own command post, radar, and supply line. The guns fired continuously, the recoil shaking the ground for blocks around. The shells rose in perfect arcs, bursting among the bombers like black stars. Smoke drifted through the sky, thick enough to obscure the sun. The city below trembled with each detonation. In one of those towers, a German officer named Wilhelm Tiedemann looked through binoculars at the incoming formations. He had seen this before, the endless silver lines that stretched into the distance, but today, they seemed different. There were more of them, tighter, more confident. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the war had shifted irreversibly. The Reich's defenses were still strong, but its air force was dying above him. The sky that had once belonged to Germany now belonged to its enemies. At 11:32 a.m., the lead formation reached the bomb run. The navigators confirmed their bearings, and the bombardiers adjusted their sights. The noise inside the aircraft rose to a deafening pitch as bomb bay doors opened. The planes flew straight and level, no evasive maneuvers, no mercy. The city below filled the glass viewfinders, a vast sprawl of smoke and stone. The bombardiers aimed not at people, but at coordinates. The Anhalter rail yards, the Siemens factories, the government ministries. But in total war, coordinates and people occupied the same space. The first wave released its bombs. The heavy ordnance fell silently, small at first, then faster, the earth pulling them down with mathematical precision. The second and third waves followed. Within minutes, the sky was empty, and the city below began to erupt. Shockwaves rippled through the air. Entire city blocks vanished in bursts of orange flame and pulverized stone. The bombs struck with terrifying regularity, like a mechanical heartbeat. The fire spread faster than anyone expected. It leapt from building to building, fed by dry winter air and the debris of earlier raids. The smoke thickened into a single, enormous column that rose miles into the sky. From the bombers above, it looked like a storm cloud forming beneath them, dark at the base, glowing red at its core. Some crews called it a fire vortex. Others simply stared, unable to describe what they saw. It was as though the city had caught fire from within. The heat from the burning districts began to generate its own weather. Air rose in violent updrafts, dragging smoke and debris thousands of feet into the atmosphere. The bombers shook as the turbulence hit them. Flames rose higher than church spires, feeding on everything that could burn: wood, fuel, flesh, paper, history. The air raid shelters beneath the city grew unbearable. The oxygen consumed by fire, the walls trembling. Survivors would later describe the roar as something beyond sound, a continuous, living howl. The pilots flying above could see the fire even through their tinted goggles. It reflected off the undersides of their wings, giving their aircraft a ghostly red glow. For many, it was the first time they truly understood the power they wielded. They had been told their mission was to destroy infrastructure, but from this height, the difference between factory and home, soldier and civilian, was erased by the brightness of the flames. Some turned their heads away, others watched until the city disappeared beneath a veil of smoke. The moral weight of war settled upon them in silence. The return journey was worse. The Luftwaffe, desperate to inflict losses, continued to attack the retreating formations. In the chaos of smoke and wind, the formations broke apart. Damaged bombers struggled to maintain altitude. Some dropped behind, becoming easy targets for pursuing fighters. Over the radio, distress calls mixed with static coordinates, shouted by men who knew they wouldn't make it home. The escorts did what they could, diving to chase the attackers. But the sky was too vast and the enemy too many. One B-17, its tail shredded and two engines gone, limped westward over the countryside. Inside, the crew fought to keep her aloft. The oxygen lines had ruptured, and frost was forming on their goggles. They flew on instinct, guided by memory and willpower. The pilot knew that if they could reach Holland, they might survive. If not, they would die nameless. One more wreck in the fields below. The co-pilot whispered a prayer into the hiss of his mask, his eyes fixed on the pale line of the western horizon. The sky behind them was still burning. Even from 100 miles away, the glow of Berlin could be seen through the clouds. It was not a single fire but thousands, merging into a single storm of destruction. The smoke spread across the continent, visible from Denmark and Poland. From the frozen edges of the Baltic Sea, Berlin had become a beacon of its own downfall, a torch illuminating the end of an age. For the German civilians who survived the raid, the hours that followed were unrecognizable. Streets that had existed for centuries were gone. Landmarks were reduced to ashes. The Unter den Linden, once the proud avenue of the Reich, lay buried under debris. Hospitals overflowed. Firefighters moved through the wreckage like ghosts, their faces blackened, their voices hoarse. The water mains were destroyed. The pumps no longer worked. People formed bucket lines, passing water from hand to hand, though most of it turned instantly to steam. The propaganda ministry tried to conceal the extent of the destruction, broadcasting words of defiance to a population that no longer believed him. The newspapers spoke of enemy terror, of sacrifice for victory, but the people of Berlin had seen too much. They no longer needed to be told that the war was lost. They could read it in the sky. In the following days, American reconnaissance photographs would confirm the devastation. Dozens of square miles reduced to rubble. The bomb damage analysis reports listed targets as completely destroyed, yet within the cold language of intelligence summaries, there was no mention of what the crews had felt as they flew through the inferno, nor of what the survivors endured below. Those stories lived only in the memories of men who would never forget the color of the firelight reflected in the clouds. By the end of January 1944, the American daylight campaign against Berlin had achieved its purpose. The Reich's defenses were stretched thin, its morale shaken, its skies no longer safe, but the cost was immense. Hundreds of airmen dead or missing, aircraft scattered across Europe, and a generation marked by what they had witnessed. The air war had reached its peak, and with it, the human capacity to bear what war demanded. By late afternoon, the daylight began to fade, but the sky over Germany remained bright with unnatural light. The fires of Berlin burned with such intensity that their glow reached the high-altitude bombers turning for home. Pilots described the reflection as a second sunrise, an orange halo visible even as darkness crept across the continent. The air was thick with smoke, drifting for miles, staining the contrails of retreating aircraft. From below, the people who had survived the bombing looked upward and saw only the black silhouettes of distant machines disappearing into the horizon. The thunder of engines faded, leaving behind a silence that seemed impossible after hours of noise and fire. In that silence came the sound of collapse. Buildings that had stood for centuries gave way under their own heat. Church spires melted, roofs caved in, walls buckled. The city that had once been the architectural pride of Europe was reduced to a landscape of ruin. The streets glowed faintly from the heat of burning asphalt. Tram lines sagged like wire caught in a furnace. The firestorm consumed everything: timber, cloth, fuel, and flesh. The temperature in some districts reached over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Survivors stumbled through the smoke, their faces covered in soot, their eyes blank. The air tasted of iron and ash. For those still alive inside the shelters, the nightmare was only beginning. The fire above devoured oxygen, creating a vacuum that pulled air and people toward it. Doors were torn from hinges by the force of suction. Underground cellars became ovens. Some shelters were sealed by debris. The people inside suffocated quietly, their candles extinguished one by one. Those who escaped to the surface found themselves in a world without air. The flames roared louder than any engine, and the wind they created tore at clothing and skin. Entire families vanished in that maelstrom, their existence erased in seconds. Above the destruction, high in the frigid air, the bomber crews looked down and saw only the results of their orders. They did not see individuals. They saw a pattern of light and shadow, of targets marked and obliterated. Yet even from that distance, the scale of the fire was beyond comprehension. Men who had flown dozens of missions over Europe said later that nothing had compared to Berlin. It was as if the city had been swallowed by the sun itself. The radio chatter during the return flight was subdued. Short phrases coded acknowledgments, the count of missing planes. Each bomber that failed to respond left an empty space in the formation, a silent absence that every man felt. Some aircraft flew home with engines burning, their wings shredded by flak, their gunners dead at their posts. Others ditched in the North Sea, where icy water claimed the survivors within minutes. The war in the air showed no mercy, not to the bombed, and not to the bombers. In the early evening, as the surviving aircraft approached the English coast, the ground controllers began counting them in. One by one, the battered fortresses appeared over the foggy horizon. Their landing lights flickered like distant candles. At the airfields, ambulances waited by the runways. Mechanics stood beside fuel trucks, silent, watching the sky. Every man on the ground knew that some of the planes they had launched that morning would never return. The gaps between arrivals grew longer. The men waited, and then they stopped waiting. When the last aircraft touched down, the briefings began. Intelligence officers gathered the crews in cold, dimly lit rooms, offering coffee and cigarettes that few could stomach. The questions were always the same: altitude, visibility, flak concentration, fighter resistance, but the answers were slower now, spoken by men who had seen the world end and continue in the same breath. The navigators spread their maps across the tables, tracing the route home with shaking hands. The bombardiers turned in their sighting reports, numbers, and coordinates written over the memory of fire. The smell of sweat, oil, and fear clung to the air long after the debriefing ended. News of the raid reached London and Washington within hours. The official communiques were triumphant. Allied bombers strike at the heart of the enemy's capital. They read, "Targets successfully destroyed." The figures were precise. Tonnage dropped, aircraft lost, percentage of damage to industrial zones. The language of war was statistical, measured, and detached. Nowhere did it mention what the men had seen through the glass of their cockpits: the great storm of fire that turned a city into a furnace. In Berlin, the fires burned through the night. From the suburbs, the glow was visible on the clouds, a pulsing red light that made the stars disappear. The wind carried ash and paper for miles. Sheets of burnt correspondence, fragments of photographs, and charred currency drifted across the countryside. In the morning, snow fell lightly over the ruins, coating the rubble in a thin, deceptive layer of peace. The contrast was unbearable: the white flakes settling over blackened stone, the silence after the storm. Rescue teams moved through the wreckage at dawn. They were soldiers, firefighters, and volunteers, men and women who no longer asked questions. They carried stretchers through streets that no longer had names, climbing over collapsed bridges, stepping carefully around unexploded bombs. The smell of smoke was everywhere. In some districts, the fires still smoldered, underground and unseen. When rescuers opened cellars, the rush of air sometimes reignited the flames, consuming what was left. The city was a labyrinth of heat and ruin. Reports from those days described sights that defied understanding: melted glass fused with cobblestones, tramcars filled with ash, the corpses of people frozen in the positions they had died, some holding hands, some shielding children. The scale of death could not be counted, only estimated. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. The exact number was irrelevant to those who lived among the ashes. The German High Command was shaken. Hitler's ministers convened in bunkers beneath the Reich Chancellery, their faces pale in the dim light. They spoke of retaliation, of new weapons, of vengeance. But the truth was undeniable. The capital of the Reich, the symbol of its power, had been humbled. The air defense network had failed. The skies over Germany belonged to the enemy. The myth of invincibility was gone, replaced by a grim acceptance that the war could no longer be won, only prolonged. For the Allies, the success was strategic but hollow. The destruction of Berlin did not end the war. It only accelerated its descent into total devastation. The bombing campaign continued week after week, spreading across every industrial city in the Reich. The same crews returned to the air, repeating the same rituals, following the same paths through flak and fire. Each mission left them emptier, harder, and quieter. They no longer spoke of victory. They spoke only of survival. Psychologists would later call it combat fatigue. The men themselves called it nothing. They simply went on flying until they were wounded, captured, or dead. The rhythm of war demanded their endurance, and they gave it. They were too young to know anything else. They were part of a generation that lived fast, died quickly, and left behind only photographs, faces smiling beside aircraft that would soon vanish into smoke. As the months passed, the raids on Berlin continued. The firestorms returned again and again, until the city became a landscape of craters and ruins. Yet even in its destruction, Berlin refused to die. The trains still ran. The ministries still issued decrees. The propaganda loudspeakers still promised victory. But the sound of those words could no longer drown out the reality. The Reich was collapsing from within, and the bombs were the echo of that collapse made visible. For the airmen who survived those missions, the memories blurred together: the roar of engines, the smell of gunpowder, the sight of fire reflected in the clouds. But there was one image they all carried: the moment when the sky itself seemed to burn. They described it in letters and diaries, in the hollow tone of men who had seen something beyond comprehension. Some wrote that it looked like hell made real. Others said it was beautiful in its horror. One pilot called it the night when the stars were drowned. The firebombing of Berlin was not the first of its kind, nor the last. Dresden would follow, and Tokyo, and many others. Each would bring new arguments about morality and necessity, about strategy and humanity. But for the men who flew through those skies, the questions came later. In the moment, there was only survival. The wind tore up their planes, the oxygen froze in their masks, and the earth below glowed as if the sun had fallen. When the bombers landed that night, they carried more than their crews. They carried the weight of what they had seen, the transformation of a city into light and ash. They had done their duty. They had followed their orders. But in the silence that followed, each man understood that the war had changed him. No one could fly above such destruction and return unchanged. The next morning, as the ground crews repaired bullet holes and patched wings, the airmen slept in their bunks, dreaming of fire. Outside, England was peaceful, its fields green and quiet beneath the winter frost. The contrast was unbearable. Across the Channel, Berlin still burned, its smoke reaching into the same cold sky. The distance between them was less than 500 miles, but it might as well have been the distance between two worlds, one alive, one dying. That night over Berlin became more than a mission. It became a symbol of what modern war had become, an event so vast and impersonal that no single human conscience could contain it. The city burned, and with it, the last illusions of clean warfare. The pilots who had once believed in precision and justice now understood that war had no precision, and justice had no place in the fire, and yet they would fly again. The fires in Berlin smoldered for days. Smoke clung to the air like a fog of memory, drifting through the ruins and into the countryside beyond. From above, reconnaissance aircraft photographed a city that no longer existed in any recognizable form. The images showed patterns of gray and black streets erased, bridges collapsed, rail yards twisted into sculptures of iron. Where once stood a metropolis of theaters, ministries, and monuments, there now lay a field of ash. Yet amid the devastation, human figures moved, small, determined silhouettes carrying shovels, buckets, and the faint remnants of order. The city, wounded and gasping, was still alive. By early February 1944, Berlin had become both a battlefield and a monument to endurance. Civilians lived among the ruins, scavenging for food, water, and warmth. Many no longer sought shelter during air raids. They stayed in the open, too tired to run, staring upward at the distant silver shapes that came each week. In their eyes was neither rage nor fear, only a kind of resignation. They had become witnesses to history's collapse. The war that had begun with parades and banners had turned their capital into a warning for the ages. In London and Washington, the images of Berlin were hailed as proof of Allied power. Newspapers carried photographs of smoke columns rising over the Reichstag, headlines declaring that the heart of Nazi Germany had been struck. To the strategists who had planned it, the raid was another step toward victory, a necessary escalation. But in quiet offices far from the front, a few men began to wonder what victory would mean in a world where cities could vanish overnight. The moral lines that had guided earlier wars had blurred. Precision had given way to annihilation. The bombing of Berlin was not just a military act, it was a declaration that total war spared nothing. The airmen who had carried out those missions returned again and again, their faces growing older long before their years. They flew through spring and into summer, crossing the same sky, following the same coordinates. Each mission blurred into the next, a cycle of noise, fire, and silence. Some survived their full tour of 25 missions. Many did not. Those who did often spoke little afterward. They returned home to quiet towns and wide American fields, where the roar of engines existed only in dreams. When they walked down Main Street, no one could see the fire still burning in their memories. They had left pieces of themselves somewhere over Germany, scattered like ashes in the wind. Historians would later debate the morality of those raids. They would argue about necessity, proportionality, and justice. Some called the firestorms acts of terror, others acts of salvation. But for the men who had been there, morality was not a theory. It was the weight in their chests as they watched the horizon turn red. They did not think of themselves as destroyers. They thought of themselves as instruments, small parts of something far larger, something that moved beyond reason. For the survivors in Berlin, the bombing became a dividing line between worlds. Before, there had been fear. After, there was emptiness. Families were scattered, neighborhoods erased. Yet life continued in strange and stubborn ways. In the mornings, people swept rubble from the doorways of buildings that no longer had roofs. Children played among the ruins, their laughter echoing through streets where nothing else moved. Soldiers passed them, their faces pale from the smoke, their uniforms coated with dust. Somewhere beneath the debris, radios still played music scratchy and distant, the faint heartbeat of a dying empire. As the war dragged on, the raids intensified. February gave way to March, March to April. Berlin burned again and again, each time rising slower from its own ashes. The people adapted to survival as a way of life. They slept by day, worked by night, and lived in a world measured by sirens and smoke. Every raid carved another piece out of the city's soul, but somehow it endured. In that endurance was a kind of defiance, not political, not ideological, but human. By the end of 1944, the balance of the war had shifted completely. The Red Army advanced from the east, the Western Allies from the west. The skies over Germany belonged entirely to the enemy now. No German fighter could rise without being hunted. No train could move without being seen. The war that had begun as conquest had turned inward, devouring the nation that had unleashed it. And above it all, the bombers still came, endless, mechanical, indifferent. When Berlin finally fell in May 1945, the city was unrecognizable. Soviet troops marched through streets lined with ruins. The Reichstag, once a symbol of power, stood hollow and blackened. Civilians emerged from cellars like ghosts, blinking in the pale spring light. They moved carefully among the wreckage, searching for the living, burying the dead. The war was over. But peace felt unreal. The silence that followed was not relief, but exhaustion, the kind that seeps into the bones and never truly fades. For the Allied pilots who had flown over Berlin, the end came quietly. Many were already scattered across the globe, transferred to the Pacific, or waiting for demobilization. The headlines of victory barely mentioned their names. The bombers, they had flown, those silver giants that had carried them across the sky, were scrapped within months, their metal recycled into the tools of peace. The world moved forward, eager to rebuild, to forget, but forgetting is a luxury history never grants entirely. The night the sky turned to fire lived on in phone reels and journals. In the stories told by old men who had once been young and afraid among the clouds. In the decades that followed, historians and survivors alike returned to that night, each trying to understand what it meant. Some saw it as necessary, a price paid to defeat an empire built on death. Others saw it as the beginning of a new and terrifying age, when technology outgrew morality. Both were right. The destruction of Berlin was both an ending and a warning. It marked the death of one tyranny and the birth of a power capable of destroying the world itself. Only a year later, atomic fire would descend on Hiroshima, and the same orange glow that had once consumed Berlin would appear again, brighter, more final. Yet amid the devastation, there was something else, something the fire could not destroy. In Berlin, amid the ashes, people rebuilt. They cleared the rubble by hand, brick by brick, often with bare fingers. Women known as Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, became the architects of renewal. They carried stones in baskets, sang while they worked, and rebuilt the foundations of homes that had once been reduced to dust. Life, fragile but relentless, returned. In that persistence lay the truest form of resistance, the refusal of death to have the last word. The airmen who had watched the fires from above grew old. Some returned to Berlin decades later, their hair gray, their uniforms replaced by civilian coats. They stood before the new city, clean and modern, its scars hidden beneath glass and steel. Some were greeted with silence, others with handshakes. A few found forgiveness in unexpected places. Time, it seemed, had reshaped even the meaning of memory. Where once there had been enemies, there were now witnesses to the same catastrophe, bound by the same sky. One of those men wrote in his diary years later, "I remember the light more than the sound. The light was everywhere, rising through the clouds, touching the wings, reflecting in our eyes. It wasn't victory. It was something else. It was the world burning itself awake." That line could have belonged to any of them, American or German, pilot or civilian. The night the sky turned to fire was not a single event, it was a revelation. A glimpse of what humanity could do to itself when ideals turned into machinery. It was proof that courage and horror could coexist in the same heart, that war could both define and destroy those who waged it. When historians speak of the air war over Europe, they count tonnage, sorties, and losses. They speak of strategy, industry, and logistics. But beneath those numbers lies a quieter truth that every bomb dropped, every explosion witnessed, every decision made at 30,000 feet was part of a chain that led not only to victory, but to understanding. The men who flew above Berlin learned, perhaps too late, that power alone could not shape the future. Only memory could. The ruins of Berlin became a mirror for the 20th century, a reflection of ambition and consequence. Its destruction was both an act of liberation and a scar on the conscience of civilization. To stand among those ruins was to feel the weight of everything the modern age had built and broken. To fly above them was to see the fragility of all things human. And yet, from that destruction came something enduring, the understanding that even in the darkest night, even when the sky itself burns, life continues, cities rise again, children are born. The world keeps moving forward, carrying with it the lessons written in fire across the heavens. So, when the pilots looked down from their cockpits that January night and saw Berlin consumed in flame, they were not just witnessing the end of a city, they were witnessing the end of an age. The industrial century, with all its dreams of progress and power, had reached its final expression in the firestorm below. The night sky reflected humanity's triumph and tragedy in equal measure. And when the engines finally fell silent, and the fires died, and the smoke cleared, one truth remained, that courage without compassion becomes destruction, and war without understanding becomes its own enemy. The night the sky turned to fire was remembered not for victory, but for what it revealed, that even at the height of human achievement, the cost of power is always paid in light and ash.